other advanced forms of energy is up. And I think one of the things that our policymakers ought to do is look at what it's going to cost to replace that fleet of traditional generation and what the mix should be over time between renewables and traditional sources of energy. Does that make any sense, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a value that nobody, I think, is quite capturing well on what is the savings of not having to, part of it's, what is the savings of having some more predictability in your fuel costs long term? We know what wind will cost to generate. We know what solar will cost to generate for a long time. Not having to burn it, we know what, not having to use it from an efficiency or demand response. We know what all that costs, and I don't think we've done a good job as an industry of sort of pricing that. If you look at, if I was a large company and I wanted to hedge my electric, right? And I said, okay, well, you know what, I'll buy 50% of it on a 5-year contract. I'll get a fixed price for 5 years. Well, the price I'm paying is higher than what I pay if I pay for a 6-month contract. So inherent in there is a value in that hedge. And nobody when they're modeling renewable energy is really capturing that very well. And then I think the second piece is the the diversification of the fuel sources, which is I think what renewable energy and energy efficiency does, is it helps us diversify. And if we look at the main area of our fuel supply in which we are absolutely not diversified is in the gasoline industry, and you can see how dangerous a spot that is to be in. We have the opportunity with pretty low cost, common sense mechanisms to begin to diversify our electric fuel source, which is arguably going to become the most important fuel source over time. And I think there's values in renewables and energy efficiency that we aren't capturing correctly and that our policymakers just aren't looking at, because we don't tend to look out beyond next year on a lot of things. But if you take a longer view, this becomes really sort of like duh on a lot of fronts.
And just like solar, I'm sorry, onshore wind has gotten to the scale where it's very close to parity with other traditional sources too. There's no reason offshore wind can't get there. I'll shut up now.
With or without government subsidies?
It's got to get there without government subsidies. The question is, what's the time period?
Yeah, and maybe it's pretty obvious, but energy efficiency beats the cost to achieve a kilowatt hour in savings is well below the cost to produce that kilowatt hour. Yeah, and this is going to be for a long time. We did a study for just the city of Yellow Springs, roughly about 2,200 houses, and we kind of asked the question, were we to actually incentivize, not even incentivize, were we just simply to strive to reduce the energy of the worst houses in Yellow Springs first, and then progressively move up the chain, we estimated that we could achieve somewhere in the range of 40% energy savings with payback equivalent to what anybody would get out of the stock market. I mean, we win, the state wins right from the get-go. And while we do this, let's invest in renewable energy to prepare for the future as well.
John?
Yeah, I just had a brief comment, and the information I picked up today, not necessarily my area of expertise, but when we're talking about cost of like new generating equipment like solar panels and coming down and whatnot, we had a new power plant, traditional power plant, planned in this state in response to very high price signals in northern Ohio. This is the way the deregulated market works: is we're not going to plan a power plant to keep prices down, electricity in line. We're going to shoot prices through the roof so that the market can respond. And that's actually going to happen in northern Ohio. The market's already been set. Northern Ohio ratepayers have no clue really that they're going to get slammed by very high electricity prices in a couple years, but this is supposed to incent new generation, which it did. We thought there was an announcement for a power plant in November, and a colleague of mine in the room told me this morning, said, hey, did you hear that plant got canceled? It got announced in November, and so I got online while we were talking, we were on a phone call, and I looked looked up, here's all these news articles from this week, this plant got canceled. And it's interesting because it's a week before one of these market auctions that set the price and determine how much anyone in Northern Ohio is going to pay for electricity. So I had been wondering, I'm thinking from a business perspective, we're not necessarily altruistic all the time. And so I'm thinking, what would I do as a business? I would announce I'm building a power plant, and then I won it to keep my prices up. That might not be the real reason. I'm editorializing and maybe being a bit glib on what the motives were. And so one of these news articles has the official, what is the reason this power plant closed? And according to one of the utility executives, it was that the sequesterer had taken away subsidies and they can no longer afford to build this power plant. And I thought, well, as the official line that is here documented as the quote, isn't that interesting that you can't make a traditional power plant fly without subsidies? And so, when wind and solar and efficiency, when there is a role of government, it was striking to me to see that's the official response for it, when we can or can't build traditional.
All kinds of energy in this country have subsidies. And one of the things, I'm just a dumb lawyer. I'm not a businessman, I'm not a finance guy, I'm not an engineer. But one of the things I've learned over time is that public policy drives investment, both at the state and the federal level. It's as simple as that.
And I think if I could just add to that, the main thing that stands between most of these technologies that we're talking about and their adoption is simply private. It is the capital markets engaging, and the capital markets don't engage when there is uncertainty. I mean, just the very fact of talking about a review of Senate Bill 221 has shut down all sorts of private capital that would have flowed into this state. I mean, just the mere mention of it, we've got to set some sort of policy and stick with it for a period of time, because that's what nobody's going to invest in these things, and the paybacks are often pretty good on these technologies. They're as good as a lot of traditional fuel sources. It's just getting some stable public policy and then figuring out some of the financial mechanisms. But it is beginning to happen more and more. We're going to start to see everything from solar to wind energy efficiency start to be securitized and become part of the public markets, because the investment, you can make money there. Investors can make good returns with little risk there. But as long as we keep talking about changing policy, that raises the risk level. You raise the risk level, you raise the cost of capital, and you push everything down the line a little bit further.
Hopefully this is spurring a few questions from the audience. I want to give opportunities to, looking at the clock here, Bill.
Yeah, I'm Bill Spalley, head of Green Energy Ohio. I think a lot of you know we're a 13-year-old nonprofit. And I just want to thank Nolan and the members of the coalition that I know have been working very hard on the legislative front. This has been a great dialogue. I want to invite all of you to our event this Friday, and particularly Saturday. We have 23 speakers, some of them in front of you. The coalition will be there. We're going to have a big pep rally over in Dublin. We're going to have 8 Teslas, so take a look at this. But I also wanted you, for your information, to know this fact. And maybe this will be printed in the dispatch. I've been trying to get them to print it. We just made a deal on page 7 with AEP Energy. I think a lot of you know I was the first consumer counsel. I was a guy who fought the utilities for 16 long years. So we just made a deal with AEP Energy. And guess what, folks? Right now, in the state of Ohio, if you buy 100% wind from AEP Energy, it is a lower rate than the price to compare for all 4 investor-owned utilities. Now, as an old advocate, that does my heart good, because I'm standing here saying to you, we have reached grid parity. So if you come this weekend, bring your utility bill, because we're going to sign you up, but we've made a deal. We're going to get $30 for everybody who enrolls in 100% wind. If you can't put solar on your house or your business, you can buy it over the wire. And that's the stealth revolution, folks. The greatest investment last year in this country were wind farms, not natural gas, wind farms into the electric grid. And the way we support this is we vote with our dollars. And so I hope you'll join us. We're going to have a much bigger pep rally. We really need you there. And again, congratulations, and do this all over the state if you can. I didn't have a question, but.
Other questions?
This is a question about the discussion on grid parity. I understand the drive to constantly lower the cost of renewables. But it seems to me that grid parity is frequently a diversion thrown up by the utilities to suppress renewable energy. And the reason I say that is that I don't care what solar costs right now. If you're required to have 1% of the electricity sold in Ohio be solar, it can be very expensive and have no impact on rates. The utilities today blend a rate. So as Dave said, you know, they've got those 50-year-old coal plants that make electricity for 4 cents. Some of them have nukes that make it for 10 or 11 cents. But that's not what the ratepayer gets charged. It gets blended. So if you were to blend renewables at, even with an aggressive standard, at a small part of the total amount of electricity that's sold, there would not be a huge price impact. And as prices continue to come down, that price impact would get less and less. So this grid parity issue always strikes me as a diversion to some extent for what we need to do in the state.
I would agree that it's a diversion, and it's a, as I said, it's a term that is very hard to quantify. It means a lot of different things. It's very difficult to say, well, what does it cost to generate a kilowatt hour from a 50-year-old coal plant versus a 2-year-old, a brand new solar plant? Well, what if the coal plant was built today? What if, that's why I kind of just, I know I'm biased, so I try and take off my bias cap. I think we've got cost caps on everything in Senate Bill 221. I don't understand the hullabaloo about, this is going to drive, it seems to be a very modest, common sense way to begin to spur an industry without having an impact on ratepayers that is barely noticeable.
Mark, I agree with you, although I'm sure that some in the dialogue would consider the word diversion to have some baggage with it. I guess, and this is just my personal view of the industry and the whole parity issue. If you look at grid parity now, this instant, in the short term, it clearly is not the right question to focus on, because renewable and advanced energy will lose every time simply because they haven't been built to scale and they're new. Over the long term, I think grid parity is relevant, over the multiple decade kind of term. And, even for offshore wind or solar or biomass or waste to energy or fuel cells, you name it, at some point that cost equation has to make sense economically. And that's what I mean by grid parity. Not necessarily that it has to be the lowest common denominator in the portfolio of energy supply, but it has to make sense. And I do think that the skeptics of the renewable and advanced energy industry use parity and factoids like, I can generate electricity at least on a fuel cost basis at 3 cents a kilowatt hour or 4 cents or what have you. Whereas, our little demonstration project will be 4, 5, 6 times that, just because of the way it's structured. There's no way around it. Does that mean that offshore wind will not make sense to invest in now for the future? Absolutely not. It's the wrong question to ask, I agree with you.
Let's go. Another question. A couple of new gorillas in the room since the enactment of 221. One is the provisions in Senate Bill 315 last year that allow for waste heat recovery to be considered either as an advanced tier or renewable energy, depending on the developer's whims. The other large one is the advent of incredibly cheap natural gas as a result of shale fracking. What kind of disruptive effect do those sorts of modifications to existing legislation and new resources have to markets, whether it be energy efficiency or renewables? I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to tackle that one.
You actually may be the best to comment on that.
I'm not going to comment on my own question.
I
So.
know. Just say,
I mean, I don't, if anybody else wants to go ahead. I keep talking, so.
Please
But,
do.
I mean, I think Senate Bill 315 made sense as a bill. I think waste heat recovery is a great use. I mean, they are smarter ways to use energy. So I think that was an acceptable, in my mind. There's going to be people who feel differently. At a certain point within the clean energy community, there's opinions diverge, but that seemed to be a pretty common sense one. I think that the shale gas thing is I wouldn't, call it a diversion would be sort of, certainly it has lowered the price of electricity in the short term, and that makes selling people on alternatives more difficult. It's the same thing when gas is at $4 a gallon, everybody's running around, and people want to take the bus and ride their bike, and when it drops down to $2.50, you couldn't give a bike away, right? So you've got a same sort of effect here, but I do think if you stretch your viewpoint out past a year or two, you start to see things a little bit differently, and we're already starting to see reports about that the amounts of gas and the price of gas and all that are coming out of there are not what they thought they were. We've got big developers pulling out. And I think that goes to that putting all your eggs in one basket in energy in any way is a dangerous idea. It's not a good idea. It is a volatile market. It always has been. It always will be. Renewables are actually a fairly stabilizing force in that because short of, Armageddon, right? We are going to be producing power, and we know what it's going to cost. And so, but in the short term, I think the natural gas thing, at least from my perspective, has been. I would have had different business projections if I had realized that I was going to be competing against 5 cent an hour energy versus 8 cent an hour energy.
Dave, you talked about the combinatorial effect between wind and natural gas. Is there? I mean, how does that work? Explain that a little bit.
Well, the way it works is, since the wind doesn't blow all the time, when the wind stops and the wind turbines aren't putting power into the grid, depending on the demand from the grid, the utility might need to add its own traditional generation to the grid to meet that demand. It was the same issue that I think Rick talked about in terms of building an infrastructure for both distribution and generation that meets the very high peaks. That's not economically sound because there's only very few times during the year that you have to call on those peaks. And the way natural gas turbines for the utility industry work, at least as I understand it, in my very rudimentary way, is you can turn them on a lot more efficiently and faster to fit in with renewables like solar and wind, intermittent renewables, than you can other, even oil, but primarily coal and nukes, because the on and off cycle takes a while. The other thing I'd like to address is your question about waste heat recovery and Senate Bill 315 or cogen or combined heat and power. I think, those forms of, they're forms of energy efficiency as well as energy supply. I think they ought to be encouraged. I don't think the legislature should stand on its head to try to, fit waste heat recovery into a renewable bucket. But I see no problem trying to appropriately encourage development of those sources. Makes all kinds of sense.
Sure.
I just wanted to speak to the question of natural gas becoming much more common through the shale gas developments, because we work in multiple different states, and what I do see is some policymakers in some states saying, hey, we've got gas in our state, and gas is cheap, and we want to encourage the gas industry here. But one of the things that they don't realize, and this is more to my colleagues in the energy efficiency world, is even with gas being cheaper, energy efficiency and demand response are still cheaper. And so the benefits that John was talking about at the very beginning, in terms of saving consumers money, creating local jobs and all that, that doesn't go away even with cheap gas for energy efficiency and demand response. I think it has a bigger impact on renewables. But where it has the absolute biggest impact is on whether those 50-year-old coal plants are going to stay in business or not. And so the advent of cheap gas from shale formations, I think, is accelerating the announcement of the retirements of the older coal plants, in combination with new federal rules on emissions from coal plants. But I heard a distinguished economist about 4 months ago basically do a whole presentation on shale gas, and at the bottom line of her presentation was that at the end, there's going to be a bunch of coal plants retired, and it's all because of the price of natural gas, and it has nothing to do, that EPA's new rules are kind of helping it along, but they would close anyway because of natural gas. And so that's what I see when I look broadly in a number of different states.
I think John raised an excellent point when he was talking about rate Armageddon in Northeast Ohio in a couple of years. One, you're absolutely right. And as I look at the power industry, any kind of power industry, what we should try to avoid are rolling crises, or having either a policy structure or a rate structure or even a market structure where you lurch from one crisis to another. And if we focus all on gas, or if we focus all on using coal, just like if we focus all on wind. I mean, Germany's in some trouble now because it's phasing out its coal and nuke plants, well, at least its nuke plants, faster than it can bring renewable and other clean energy online. And you have to have policies that sort of diffuse the crisis, and that's one of the things that Senate Bill 221 does very well. It enables the market to even out some of those bumps as you look at prices, supply and demand curves over time.
I could just, since there's like 10 seconds left, I was gonna say, yeah, I think natural gas is an important bridge fuel. Dave mentioned it helps firm up renewable energy, which until we get batteries or other forms of energy storage in line, which is probably further behind the solar panels, we're gonna need something to level out renewable energy production. Big industry, glass, steel, paper mills. These are plants, we have many in Ohio that use as much electricity as an entire metropolitan area the size of Columbus for their residential load. And if they don't have natural gas to power their processes and low energy costs, then they'll go overseas and burn coal. And so from a carbon perspective, right now, I mean, as tough as it is to admit, for the next 10, 20 years, we're going to have these big industries. We don't have a substitute. We don't really have good ways to affect their energy consumption. Natural gas and combined heat power is one way. And if you look at, if your concern is carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions, right now our CO2 emissions are below where they would have been if McCain-Lieberman had been enacted. A big part of that's the recession. Another big part of that is natural gas. And so it's a low carbon domestic bridge fuel, and I think it's going to be around for 20 years. And in 20 years we can have another panel and see if I feel the same way about it.
Okay, and with that, I think we'll convene. I want to thank, please join me in thanking our panelists. I also want to thank Ohioans for Clean Affordable Energy for pulling this together, and of course I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I hope you have a safe drive home and a very nice rest of your evening.
Oh yeah, and one quick thing. Thank you so much, Scott. So let's give Scott a round of applause. And also, we talked about this great law and how forward-looking it is. Well, the guy who is in large part responsible for it is sitting right there, Mark Shanahan. So let's give him Finally, Brian here, who I work with, has a quick announcement that he's going to make.
Thanks, Nolan. Thanks, everybody, for coming. So all of you are here today, I would assume, because you're interested in Ohio's clean energy economy, because you're passionate about it, because you aspire someday maybe to work in that sector of the economy. So thank you, everyone, for coming out. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your insights and thoughts today. But this conversation doesn't end here. All of you can participate in this conversation because this month is the 5-year anniversary of Ohio's clean energy law. 5 years ago, Senate Bill 221 was passed, and we're celebrating that all month long on social media. So if you have a cell phone and you have a Facebook account on it, if you're on Twitter and you're sending your 140-character thoughts about what food you're eating, if you're taking pictures of your food on Instagram, if you're on social media, that's what people do these days. People do that. No one likes to make fun of me for it. So if you're on social media and you want to celebrate the success of Ohio's clean energy law, there's a piece of paper right here. You can pick one up. It tells you everything you need to know. You can go on there. You can add your thoughts. You can tell us why you like clean energy, why you support Ohio's clean energy economy. You can take pictures of your favorite projects and of efforts that you've seen around the state, and help us all celebrate and continue this conversation and add your voice to it. So thanks again, everyone, for coming out. Please be sure to grab a piece of paper. There's some outside, and I'll put some up here too as well. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Scott.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Scott. Hey, good to meet you. It's, I'm on the email. We have a guy ready for us. Filling in for you. No, I'm just watching. That's why
There was a recent study.
Yeah.